All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight here at The Volume. Happy Thursday, everybody. Happy NBA Draft Day. We're going to be hitting the big Boston Celtics trade from last night, sending Kristaps Porzingis to the Celtics and Marcus Smart to the Memphis Grizzlies. I also have some thoughts on the debate for the Charlotte Hornets over whether or not to take Brandon Miller or Scoot Henderson. And then at the end, I'm going to be going over the Damian Lillard situation with the Portland Trail Blazers and why I think it's so important that both sides move on from their current situation. Don't forget, later tonight, we're also going to be going live on YouTube with the guys from Nerd Sesh and Mr. Colin Cowherd. Colin's going to be on for the first pick. I'll be on for the first three picks. And then the Nerd Sesh guys are going to take it the rest of the way. They dive into the draft almost year-round, and they're flat out way better at it than I am. And I hope you guys will check their stuff out because I think they're some of the best that we have in the business. You guys know the drill. Before we get started, subscribe to the Volume's YouTube channel so you don't miss any more of our videos. Follow me on Twitter at _JasonLT so you guys don't miss any show announcements. And if for whatever reason you guys miss one of these shows and you can't get back over to YouTube to finish, don't forget you can find them wherever you get your podcasts under Hoops Tonight. So before we talk some basketball, I very much enjoyed hopping out of town for the last week. For the most part, got to disconnect from work. We were expecting a Bradley Beal trade of some kind, and thankfully I had done almost all the prep on it, at least as it pertains to the type of player that Bradley Beal is, before we left. So when the news came down, I didn't have to work too much, only about 20 minutes or so. And after that, I got to disconnect for the entirety of the trip. And this is something my wife and I do every year around this time. So Tucson, Arizona is amazing. It's a much bigger town than people realize. There's over 1 million people in this city, and it's beautiful. It's a higher elevation than Phoenix, so it's cooler, and we're surrounded by massive mountains. We have 3 mountains just nearby who are just in this valley that are over 8,500 feet and another 2 that are over 9,000 feet. And so it's just kind of a different kind of Arizona higher desert vibe. But it still gets hot as shit here for about 2 months in July and August in particular. And so every year we always take a couple trips in this June, July time to get out of town and just get away from the heat. And so we went up to Montana for a week, stayed in Ennis, which is a town that's about an hour south of Bozeman. Got to see Yellowstone, something I hadn't seen since I was a kid. That was incredible. To me, the volcanic features stole the show. It just is like impossible to wrap your brain around. Like 2/3 of the world's active geysers are literally in Yellowstone. It's a completely unique feature on planet Earth, and I enjoyed getting to see that. Spent a whole day out there. The sun doesn't go down till like 9:30 this time of year, so you can be out for like a 12-hour day easy. I also got to see the Museum of the Rockies, which is one of the larger collections of dinosaur fossils in North America. That was a lot of fun for me because I find dinosaur paleontology to be super fascinating, especially the science behind it. But for the most part, I just got to kick back and hang out with my wife and relax. We got a little we stayed at a cabin in Ennis and just overlooked the valley, the beautiful mountains, and just got to relax, get away from basketball for a little bit. That said, we are right back into it. We got the NBA draft tonight. Obviously, we have a big trade we're covering right now. Probably we'll see a couple more trades. Then I know myself and a bunch of other Volume folks are heading to Vegas for Summer League, so you guys will get a chance to come say hi in person, as well as we're going to be producing a bunch of content while we're there. And then free agency is this week, next weekend. It starts on July 1st, and it'll be a little tricky because I'm going to a wedding for a family member in Texas, but I plan on covering that as well. So we're right back into the thick of it, at least for the next month or so, until things finally slow down heading into the late portion of the summer, which is where we'll get into our long-term stuff when we're covering like player rankings, all-time player rankings, and then get into our season previews. You guys know the drill. On that note, let's talk some basketball. So the Celtics trade. Quick summary, the Celtics got Kristaps Porzingis and 2 first-round picks. The Wizards got Tyus Jones and Danilo Gallinari, as well as Mike Muscala and a second-round pick. And the Grizzlies get Marcus Smart. So I want to hit it from the angle from all 3 teams because I think there's an interesting story on all 3 fronts. First of all, for the Wizards, I think it's kind of ridiculous that they waited to tank until the year after one of the most stacked drafts in NBA history, but it is what it is. At this point, they're doing a decent job for as cheap as they gave up Bradley Beal for, which was a whole other thing, which it's always hard to say what a player's value is after the fact, because you don't know what kind of offers were being made. You don't know what other kind of behind the scenes things were taking place to kind of manipulate a situation. But for as cheap as that was, I actually thought they got a decent return for Kristaps Porzingis. I think obviously you just get the second round pick, but Tyus Jones is a highly desirable guard in this league. And I could see Tyus Jones being moved for a first round pick this summer. So that's an asset that comes back in the Kristaps Porzingis trade that gives you potentially another first round pick. And then Danilo Gallinari and Mike Muscala will both be targeted likely as role players on the margins for second round picks. Mike Muscala, kind of a backup center that can stretch the floor. And then Danilo Gallinari is your textbook rim pressuring forward, kind of as a second option kind of thing. Little surprised that Boston gave him up, because I think he provides a different type of offensive attack. But then again, they're hoping to get some of that from Kristaps Porzingis as well. So it might all work out. For the Wizards, I think the smart move from here is to sign Kyle Kuzma to a long-term deal, as long as you can get for around $30 million a year, which may seem like a ton of money now and might seem like an overpay for Kyle Kuzma, but with the next TV deal coming and the significantly larger salary cap that we'll have when you get to the later years of that deal, chances are Kyle Kuzma around $30 million will be a giant discount, kind of the way that we saw $20 million small forwards in the previous 5 years or so. So that would be where I'd go from there in the rebuild. For Boston, it's a super interesting move on several levels, because I remember when Brogdon was kind of rumored to be included in the original version of the deal with the Clippers, I thought, okay, so like you have a kind of a glut of ball handling, right? Like you've got a surplus there, and rim protection is a little bit tricky for you with some of the limitations that Horford and Robert Williams have. So you're turning one of your secondary ball handlers, I should say, but in your surplus into a positional need, which is rim protection. When Smart was included in the deal, I thought it made a lot less sense. It just mainly because of the fit, and I want to dive into that a little bit. So obviously Marcus Smart wasn't as good defensively as he was last year, but that was a team-wide problem. I don't want to just blame Marcus Smart for that. The Celtics as a team weren't as tough and committed on the defensive end as they were last year, so I don't think that's fair to blame that on Marcus Smart. Also, Marcus Smart was one of their best competitors, one of their most fiery guys, which was something that they lacked after Ime Udoka left, and so losing Marcus Smart, I think, hurts the personality of the team a little bit. That said, Kristaps Porzingis brings a lot to the table, and if he plays up to his potential, he can cover that gap. Defensively, statistically, he was a good rim protector last year, in large part because he does have great physical tools for the job. Teams ran 555 pick and rolls at Kristaps last year and scored just 468 points, which is very good. He was also one of only 12 players in the league to log at least 100 blocks. So in the numbers, he was a decent rim protector. On tape, not so much. I was watching a bunch of footage of him covering and pick and roll this morning. Pretty damn lazy, doing the bare minimum, just kind of waiting around for guys to drive into him. That said, like he was on a really bad team that had nothing to play for. And we've seen stretches of really good rim protection from Kristaps Porzingis in his career. So not the same type of player that we like. What he was last year in Washington won't be good enough. But I do know that he's capable of being the type of rim protector that Boston needs. Remember, rim protection is one of the most consistent things that we see in championship teams. Denver was the exception. The Gordon Jokic front court was the worst rim protecting front court of the last 30 champions. But as you go back through NBA history, it's almost always great rim protection, right? So as much as Denver was the exception to the rule, that doesn't mean that that's the route that you should go when you're team building. You should absolutely be targeting rim protection. So obviously Kristaps helps with the very specific need. And the problem for Boston over the last few years was they were always better defensively with Robert Williams on the floor, but they were always better offensively when Rob was off the floor and they had Al Horford at the 5, so they had more spacing for driving lanes. So kind of what Kristaps Porzingis brings to the table is the best of both worlds, an option to play 5 out while simultaneously giving yourself legitimate rim protection, which is something they couldn't do with Al Horford, who really struggled defensively over the course of this particular playoff run. On the offensive end of the floor, in ball screens, he almost always pops about 2/3 of the time. It's like 64% of the time. The times that he rolls, he's typically rolling to try to post up. He's not a traditional roll hard to the rim, a lob threat kind of guy the way that Robert Williams was. But when he pops, he does a really good job of knocking down those pick and pop threes and attacking and driving closeouts. As a matter of fact, Kristaps Porzingis scored 1.17 points per possession in those situations and shot 57% in effective field goal percentage popping in pick and roll. Now, that is in large part because of the shooting from the top of the key. Attacking closeouts, he was much better going left than going right, something to keep in mind. In a playoff series, teams will identify that and drive a closeout on his left shoulder really hard and try to funnel him to his right hand. So an unusual situation where a right-handed player is actually better going left when he's driving closeouts. In spot-up situations, 1.18 points per possession. One of only 15 players in the league this year to log at least 300 spot-up possessions and to average over 1.08 points per possession in those situations. But again, three-point shooting is driving most of those numbers. But there's no doubt that he's going to help them a lot in pick and pop and in spot-up situations with his shooting, which is extremely rare. We're going to talk about this a lot when we talk about Victor Wembanyama tonight with the Nerd Sesh guys and with Colin Cowherd. But the rim protecting five that also stretches the floor is an extremely rare concept. As a matter of fact, 0 times in the last 3 years has an NBA player averaged over 2 made threes per game and over 2 blocks per game. So it's extremely rare. And it's because Kristaps Porzingis, as good as a shooter as he is, not the best rim protector in the world, although he is a good one. Post-ups. 325 points last year on 288 post-ups, including passes. That ranked 4th out of 13 players in the NBA who averaged at least 250 post-ups. So very, very effective post-up player. 3 guys ahead of him were Nikola Jokic, Joel Embiid, and Luka Doncic. So he's in some really good company there on top of the league. On film, he's surprisingly physical for a guy who's very thin. He's very good at turning a three-quarter front into an easy layup. So when players really try to reach around and front the post on him, he's very good at reversing that leverage and giving a passing angle to catch and then quick turn to the basket. The way Porzingis attacks out of the post is pretty simple. If you play him straight up and you don't give an angle, he's going to turn and face, and he's going to take some kind of jump shot, a short jump shot, either in a jab step or off the dribble. And that kind of, think about like Joel Embiid. That's kind of what Kristaps Porzingis is as a face-up player. He's going to turn and face. He's going to do those quick little hezzies and jab steps, and he's going to get to a little 15-foot jump shot. As soon as you start to play an angle on him, so if you lean on his left shoulder or lean on his right shoulder, he's constantly trying to pivot off of that and go all the way to the rim. He doesn't take a lot of hook shots. He shot really well on them. This year, I want to say he was 68% on hook shots, but he only took like 25 all season long. So he's not a guy who's going to bump you with his back to the basket and turn and take a hook shot. If you play him straight up, he's going to turn and face and try to get to a pull-up jump shot or a jab step jump shot. And if you play an angle, he's going to spin off of you and go all the way to the rim, which he's very good at. And that's why he was such an effective post-up player this year. So kind of my final take on it to wrap it all up on the Boston front. There's no doubt that Kristaps is going to help the Celtics offensively. He's a great spot-up player. Pick and pops are one of the best ways to create space for driving lanes because the roll man defender, when he's guarding in pick and roll and the screener pops, he kind of has to lean that side and he has to be prepared to close out, especially on a player like Kristaps who's so effective there, that when that screen defender vacates there, that's where the driving lane is, especially if you're chasing the ball handler over the top. Most of the time that actually ends in switches, and like we talked about, Kristaps Porzingis is great at beating switches in the post, and if Jayson Tatum re-embraces some of the clear side ISO stuff that he did in the later parts of the Eastern Conference Finals, especially against centers that switch onto him, he can have some success there. We even saw a little bit of that against Joel Embiid in Game 7 against the Sixers. But the reality is, and it also gives him a post-up option, obviously, like a different offensive angle. Okay, all of this high ball screen, high ISO stuff with Tatum and Brown's not working. Let's throw it down to the post and Kristaps Porzingis. That gives you another option there. But the only way the Celtics team is winning a title is if they regain their defensive identity from 2022, the one that carried them to within 2 wins of the championship. As a result, they're going to need Kristaps Porzingis to have his best defensive season as a pro, especially to make up for the loss of Marcus Smart. That, to me, that defensive end defines everything for this team. So I look at the Kristaps thing as more of a rim protection thing than an offensive thing, because that's the only way this team's winning, because they don't have good enough top-tier ball handling. Overall, again, I would have preferred it giving out Brogdon than Smart, but I do like the deal. I just like it less with Smart than I do with Brogdon. I think you need to get the ball out of Marcus Smart's hands and put the ball in Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown's hands more, so getting Marcus Smart out of there actually helps. He ran over 350 pick and rolls this year. He's a high-volume ball handler, so kind of getting him out of there just simplifies some of the ball handling stuff. And they needed two-way rim protection so that they can run five-out offense while also protecting the rim. Kristaps gives you that. And most importantly, another body to throw at Jokic. Like, that's just a new thing that all the teams in the league have to prepare for. At some point in time, you're probably going to have to play a playoff series against Nikola Jokic. Helps to have three bodies to throw out of him instead of two. And then also, I thought it was just an interesting way to kind of mix up the locker room chemistry without doing too much to ruin your continuity. All right, looking over at Memphis. I see what they were thinking. They had two big needs, right, coming into this offseason. They needed someone to come in and be the grown-up in the locker room to help with culture, and they needed someone to fill the Dillon Brooks role as that primary perimeter defender and second-side ball handler. I just don't particularly love the Marcus Smart fit with Memphis. There are a couple of reasons. One, Dillon Brooks was already a touch small for a primary wing defender at 6'6". Now, if you put Marcus Smart in there, you're going to be starting a lineup with Ja Morant, Marcus Smart, and Desmond Bane. And Desmond Bane is like 6'5", maybe, with basketball shoes on, right? So he's the tallest guy in that group. And now you're playing three guys like that. Ja Morant is extremely small and extremely thin. Marcus Smart is strong and a good defensive player, plays bigger than he is, but he's only 6'3". So you're building a core lineup that is pretty small there. So trying to replace Dillon Brooks, I would have tried to go for somebody bigger. Also, Marcus Smart is a player who thinks very highly of himself offensively and will co-op offensive possession. Statistically, he was actually a very good pick-and-roll ball handler this year, and I'm sure a lot of Memphis fans will cling to that. He might even have been the best. As a matter of fact, he averaged 1.18 points per possession in pick-and-roll, including passes, which was number one out of 83 players who ran at least 350 pick-and-rolls this year. So statistically, he was effective, in large part because he's very good at getting dribble penetration and he's a very good passer. That automatically creates a lot of defensive rotation situations, which is where your lesser offensive players can play better because they have an advantage. It's a big way to create offense in pick and roll. He is good at that. But we talked about this after the season. I think that top-end ball handling is more important than aggregate ball handling. It was a big lesson we learned from the Celtics. It's more about how good your top guys are, not about how good your ancillary guys are in terms of initiating offensive possessions. Obviously, you need good role players to finish offensive possessions and to help with the dirty work, but your primary guys are the guys that you lean on the most in the playoffs. And one of the things we learned about Memphis in the playoffs is their primary guys aren't good enough. Ja Morant had a nightmare offensive postseason series against the Lakers. Now, again, the Lakers are a very good defensive team, but something to keep in mind. Ja Morant's high pick and roll amounted to just 64 points on 74 possessions. He's very predictable. He's very, you can funnel him to the basket. He's only going to take a pull-up three if he's wide open, and he shot pretty well on him. He shot, 53% effective field goal percentage on pull-up jump shots in this playoff run, and that still didn't amount to success in pick and roll. Again, just 64 points on 74 pick and rolls, 13 points on 19 ISOs. He won't shoot that pull-up jumper unless he's wide open, so if you stunt at him a little bit, you can dissuade him to take that jump shot. He's not the best passer in the world, and if you funnel him into traffic, he's not going to finish at the rim extremely well. He's going to fall down, he's call for fouls that he's not going to get, and you're going to have issues in transition defense. So I'm not trying to shit on Ja Morant. I'm just saying he's got a long way to go. Like, Ja Morant needs to get a lot better. And so one of the things you need to do is lean more into him and help him get reps and help him develop as a ball handler, because he's your top end guy that you're going to need in the postseason down the line. A bunch of Marcus Smart action is just going to stunt that development, in my opinion. Desmond Bane was actually their best player in the postseason, especially in Game 4 and Game 5. I thought he was the best player on the floor, counting Lakers players in those two games, until LeBron James just stole Game 4 with a couple of big plays at the end of regulation and in OT. And then Jaren Jackson actually logged a point per possession in post-ups in this postseason. So those three guys need to get as many touches as possible. And so I don't love the idea of throwing in kind of a gunner, a guy that thinks more highly of himself than he should offensively. That's going to take possessions away. And then every possession he's not on the ball, you put Marcus Smart off the ball. And he was one of the worst spot-up players in the league this year. He was below a point per possession, shot just 35%. There were 68 players in the league last year to log at least 250 spot-up possessions, and Marcus Smart ranked 56th in efficiency on those possessions. So a bottom fourth high volume spot up player in the league. Not a very good cutter either. He scored on cuts just 6 times all season. So that's the issue, is you put him on the ball. He's actually pretty good, but not good enough to be the best player on a championship team. And all he's doing is taking away touches from the players that need the touches for their development. And then if he's off the ball, he presents all these issues because he's not a very effective off-ball player. So it can work. He just needs to come in and change the culture. He needs to be more active off the ball. He needs to dial back up the defensive end and make an all-defense team, and he can actually help Memphis get to a point where they overcome some of the things that got them beat last year. But it also can go wrong. He's not a very respected vet. He's only 29 years old, and he hasn't won a championship, so it's not like he's going to walk into the locker room and all these young dudes are going to worship him. Like, if Marcus Smart doesn't put his money where his mouth is with his play, don't be surprised if some of these younger players tune him out or roll their eyes at him. So, again, like, if that was the angle of the trade, I would have gone for an older, more respected player. That's not to say that Marcus Smart can't help in those ways. He absolutely can. He's a bona fide professional. He's a grown-ass man. He's played winning basketball for a long time, but it's just there needs to be a certain level of cachet to get buy-in from younger players, and I'm curious if Marcus Smart has got enough of a reputation to facilitate that. 2, their starting lineup is officially really tiny, and so that could cause some problems, especially if Memphis has to play 2 bigs to make up for it, play Jaren Jackson at the 4, which can start to really hurt their spacing. And then also he can stunt the development of the younger guys by dominating the ball. So there's a version of this that can work out, and there's a version of it that can't. And it really just depends on Marcus Smart and whether or not he's willing to buy into a smaller offensive role and dive in entirely into the defensive end. All right, let's move on to this Brandon Lillard, Scoot Henderson thing. So Charlotte apparently is on the fence between the two, as Shams Charania reported this morning. I think Charlotte should go with Brandon Miller. And there's a couple different reasons why. First of all, positional need. Obviously, you've got a primary guard already in LaMelo Ball. I've talked a lot about the archetypes of players that are archetypes of star players in the league, right? And if you guys remember, I had 5. There was the big playmaking forward, think Luka Doncic or LeBron James. The big scoring forward, think Kevin Durant or Paul George. The star center, think Joel Embiid or Nikola Jokic or Anthony Davis. The hyper-athletic guard, think Ja Morant or Russell Westbrook, Derrick Rose, that kind of guy, De'Aaron Fox. And then there's the unicorns. These are guys that don't really fit into any of those categories but are still stars. I'm thinking guys like Giannis or Steph Curry. Of all of those archetypes, hyper-athletic guards are my least favorite archetype. If you remember, I said that last summer. They all turn out to be bad defenders, in large part because they have a ton of offensive responsibility, and they don't have the length that naturally bothers players when they're kind of mailing things in. Like, you can be lazy defensively to a certain extent if you've got great physical tools and still hold your own defensively, but you can't do that if you're also small, and that's the problem. They're also very heliocentric, these super athletic guards, so they usually struggle to manage games. They usually struggle to control pace. They usually kind of have a one speed that they go at kind of thing. You've seen that with all of these hyper athletic guards over the years, whether it's Derrick Rose or Ja Morant or Russell Westbrook. That's been a consistent theme. And then they struggle with skill development. They lean on their athleticism a lot when they're younger, and so usually they don't have great habits in the gym as it pertains to working on their skills. That's why guys like Russell Westbrook end up in their late career with their athleticism fading and not having the skill to make up for it. And Ja Morant, I think, is one of the guys that could potentially break that mold, but he hasn't done so yet. But, and again, none of this means that Scoot can't beat the trend. Of course, Scoot can beat the trend and become the first hyper-athletic guard that's the best player on a championship team, but it's just a trend that front offices should factor in. If you're looking at those two players, you have to consider the risk of a Scoot Henderson archetype. He's a type of player that historically hasn't really done that well in the NBA, at least on the highest levels, and the big scoring forward we've seen work a lot of times, right, with guys like Kawhi Leonard and Kevin Durant. So it's just a safer bet, I think, in my opinion. Brandon Miller is your textbook big scoring forward. It's not my favorite archetype. As you guys know, my favorite archetype is the big playmaking forward. But I do think that big scoring forwards are more consistently impactful typically than the hyper-athletic guards. And that's why it makes so much more sense for Charlotte. LaMelo Ball is already a heliocentric playmaking guard, kind of a unicorn in his own sense. Brandon's wing scoring is the perfect complement to that archetype. We've seen this a bunch over the years. We just saw it with Jokic and Murray. Jokic is this big playmaker. Jamal Murray's like high-level scoring is the perfect complement to it. LeBron James with Kyrie Irving, Steph Curry with Kevin Durant in the 2017-2018 Warriors. Like, you've seen this work a lot. When you've got a guy who's a defense warper mixed with a guy who's just a sheer force of skill offensive scorer, those two things tend to work pretty well. Now, neither of these guys are perfect, and they both have a ton of flaws. Brandon Miller was super inefficient in ISO and in pick and roll last year. Obviously, he's got a lot to grow. Not a very good rim finisher. A lot of things that he has to work on, but they're young players. So, obviously, you're going to find a ton of flaws when you're looking at kids. The other thing, too, is big forwards can help a lot with the dirty work. On the defensive end of the floor, obviously taking primary wing defensive assignments. Obviously, Brandon Miller's not there yet, but he has the potential. And then length and athleticism always helps on the glass and in transition. Anytime the ball's up in the air or people need to run, having a better, longer athlete tends to help. So I think Charlotte should take Brandon Miller. I think that's the safest bet right now. One last note on Brandon Miller liking Paul George. This was going around, and it's Brandon Miller's like, I think Paul George is the GOAT, and everyone freaked out. And look, do I agree? Obviously not. But something you guys got to learn is like these young players in particular, any young basketball player, and those of you guys who listen to this show who are young basketball players know exactly what I'm talking about. Your favorite player usually has a lot more to do with the type of stuff that you emulate on the court than it does the overall, personality or whatever, right? Like LeBron James was my favorite player growing up, but I couldn't replicate anything that he does. I was a big, strong athlete in college, but I was a big, strong athlete kind of compared to I was just another big, strong athlete on the court, right? Like LeBron was bigger, stronger, faster than everybody on the court every single game he played in. Like I could never emulate the things that he did on the court. So when I was a kid, I was highly I was obsessed with Carmelo Anthony and what he did on the court because I had a really good jab step game and good footwork, and I could work out of the high post, low post, facing up, back to the basket stuff. And so I always wore number 15 in college because I wanted to pay homage to Carmelo Anthony. And every time I was in the gym working on my game, I was watching Carmelo Anthony footage and trying to replicate it in my skill development, right? And so even though Carmelo Anthony was a different kind of favorite player for me. And that's kind of the way I see the Brandon Miller thing. I don't think Brandon Miller actually thinks Paul George is the most successful basketball player of all time, but Paul George is a player that he probably replicates in a lot of different ways because he's a long, athletic 6'8" wing that's kind of thin, that's a freak athlete, and that does a lot of work off the dribble into pull-up jump shooting and slashing. And so it's kind of a really interesting player for Brandon Miller to emulate. And so I actually found that kind of cool, and I wasn't annoyed at it at all. And I think it was authentic, and I thought it was cool that he spoke up and said that. What Portland should do with Damian Lillard. So the reality is the Portland Trailblazers are not even close to contending. Forget about health. Even when their three best players were available, and the three best players were Damian Lillard, Anthony Simons, and Jeremy Grant. When those three guys were available and on the court together at the same time, they had a negative point differential in over 2,000 possessions, according to Cleaning the Glass. Remember, that filters out garbage time. So this is not a group that is one move away. They are miles and miles away. Even if you guys remember my list of the top 10 characteristics of championship teams, they severely lack in a bunch of those areas. Remember, number one was size. They severely lack size. Number two was strength. They severely lack strength. All of their stars even are thin players that rely on finesse to get to spots rather than strength. They don't have an elite unit. Remember, you have to be super elite on the offensive end or the defensive end. They were 18th in offense or 28th in defense last year. They do not have above average role players, which we learned is an important characteristic of championship teams. They don't have an elite coach. They have a young, inexperienced coach. They're not versatile on either end of the floor. They basically just rely on Anthony Simons or Damian Lillard to get super hot pull-up jump shooting and pick and roll. And they don't have continuity, and they certainly won't have continuity if they make a big trade. So the reality is if you're on the fence and it's like, hey, we need to decide either to keep Dame and try to go for it or get rid of him and rebuild, I would understand the debate more if you were on the fence, meaning hey, we're one move away, one or two pieces away. We lost in the conference finals last year, so we're this close. It's no, you missed the playoffs. You had a negative point differential with all your core players on the floor. You're not close. There's no one trade you can make that fixes all of your problems. You are You are sorely deficient in many of the key areas of championship basketball, so it's time to move on. And my guess is Dame, because of his little run-in with Paul George in the bubble talking about running from the grind, has boxed himself into a corner where he's a hypocrite. Who cares what anybody thinks, man? You're not winning. You're not even close to winning. You're getting older, and you're one of the best basketball players of all time, in my opinion. So why don't you take that ability and bring it to a spot where you can actually showcase that ability on the highest stages of the NBA? And you've been more than loyal to Portland. If anything, they should give you a little bit more say in where you get to go. But at the end of the day, it's time. Running this back, all you're doing it is for pride at this point. All you're doing it is to back up some stupid trash talk that you had 3 years ago. Forget about it, man. You're way better than Paul George. No one thinks that Paul George is better than you. So just do what you need to do to get to a situation where you can demonstrate what your top-end basketball ability is. Before we get out of here, I did have a couple of people complaining at me that I hadn't actually talked about the Ja Morant suspension yet. And this is all I'm going to say on it. I'm a basketball analyst. That's what I do. You're never going to hear me talk about politics. Quite frankly, I don't care about politics. I deliberately distance myself from it because I find it to be toxic. You guys aren't going to hear me talk about dudes' personal lives a whole lot because I'm just a basketball guy, right? Here's all I'm going to say on the Ja Morant thing. I think kids are stupid. You know how I know? Because I was a kid, and when I was a kid, I was stupid. Even now, I bet you when I look back when I'm 37 instead of 31, I'll probably look back and go, man, I was stupid back then too. I still had a lot to learn. But you especially are going through an era of poor judgment and learning in your early 20s and late teens. That's just a fact. All of you guys who are older than that know by now. And so I don't think Ja Morant's a bad guy. I think he's a good guy who's made some poor decisions, and this is officially rock bottom. The example that I would use is, I had really poor study habits when I was young. So, for instance, I didn't play college basketball until my third year in college. In my first 2 years in college, I was an awful, awful student. Super, super lazy. All I did was go to the gym and work out, did the bare minimum to get through classes. And what was rock bottom for me was in my third year, I got my first basketball scholarship to play at Pima. I'm super, super excited. This is a junior college in local Tucson. And I go in for the season. We make it through training camp. And sometime in early October, I get called into the office and they're like, you're ineligible, right? You can't play. You don't have the grades. And that was the wake up call for me. When the game of basketball was taken away from me, I woke up in some of my big weaknesses, which was one of them was just laziness and study habits. And then I went through this crazy process where I took 12 units over winter break and got all A's so that I was eligible for the spring. Took 12 units in the spring, then had to take 12 units again in the summer to make myself eligible in the grand scheme of the year for the following season. And I did well, got all A's and B's, got through it. And so that rock bottom, getting the game taken away from me, actually helped me become a better person and become a better student, helped me wake up and grow up, so to speak, right? And I was a good student from that point forward and never had to miss a game for eligibility concerns. That's kind of the way I look at this Ja Morant thing. Obviously, a totally different situation from the standpoint of what the issue was, but the game of basketball got taken away from Ja Morant. And as a young kid who loves the game, that's devastating. It was devastating for me. I know it's devastating for Ja. And so having the game taken away, I believe will be the thing that wakes him up. And so I believe Ja's a good person. I believe he's going to show us he's a good person. This was his rock bottom. I hope this is the end of it. And I hope that from now on, we only talk about Ja Morant as a basketball player. And for the most part, that's where I'd like to keep the show as much as possible. I'm not going to sit here and pontificate about Ja Morant's home life or about his support system or about the people that he has advising him. That's not my place. And quite frankly, I don't even know. Anything I've heard is just gossip through reporting channels. And so I don't feel comfortable talking about that. I just don't. It's not my place and certainly isn't the reason why you guys come to listen to me. So that's all I'm going to say about the Ja Morant thing. And like I said, we're not going to talk about it again until he's back on the basketball court. All right, guys, that's all I have for right now. We'll be back tonight with our draft special. As always, I appreciate you guys, and we will see you then.